Welcome to this session of Family Communication. In this session, we'll wrap up the conversation we've been having about the research regarding what correlates with a satisfying, successful marriage. In previous sessions, we've talked about everything from sex to closeness to different notions of whether people are putting in and getting out of the relationship what they expect, all sorts of things that are related to marital success and to marital satisfaction. And so in this session, we want to take a longer view. We want to recognize that, typically speaking, we expect marriages to last till death do us part, which implies that marriage will last over a considerable amount of time. And over that amount of time, a lot of things will happen along the way. Kids might appear. Parents might age. You might move several times. All sorts of things can happen as people change and as life circumstances swirl about a particular marriage. And so the question in this session is, so how does marital communication change over the course of the life cycle of a marriage? Or to put it differently, as the years roll on, how does marital communication change? And in particular, how do the changes in that marital communication influence marital satisfaction and marital success? Well, let's start with what the research says about marital success and communication in the early years of a marriage. Art Bachner is a researcher who previously taught at the University of Illinois, and Bachner is the leading researcher into how it is that marital communication is evident in the early years of a marriage. And one of the things that Bachner does is he says that marital satisfaction is at its highest point here in these early years of marriage. Now, that might fly in the face of what you typically think of, because you're oftentimes told, oh, the first year of marriage is difficult. And it's true. There are some adjustments that need to be made in the first year of marriage. In fact, we'll talk about some of Bachner's research with respect to those challenges in a moment. But generally speaking, compared to later periods in the marriage, these early years of marriage typically feature very high levels of marital satisfaction. What's interesting is that when people are not satisfied in these early years of a marriage, they tend to adopt an intrapersonal kind of script. That is to say, they tell themselves, they communicate to themselves inside their head, it's okay, things will get better with time. I just need to give it time. And so there's very much this idea that we believe that time will change things. That's particularly true for things that are negative. If, for example, you're not feeling as close to your spouse as you thought you would, then the expectation is that the more time goes on, the more likely that is to change. And so what's interesting is that in these early years, people don't believe that there's necessarily a need to change patterns of communication, but instead, naturally over time, people's patterns of communication will change. Now, that's not true. In fact, all of the research suggests that unless people make intentional changes to their patterns of communication, communication is likely not to change. In fact, most research suggests that our patterns of communication are relatively inert. That is, they stay put until something happens to make them change. Now, that becomes very important because Bachner's research finds that in the early years of a marriage, couples have particular challenges that are rather unique to that section of their married life. So, for example, Bachner talks about what he calls commitment challenges. In Genesis, when marriage was established, the Bible talks about leaving and cleaving. That is to say, leaving your family of origin and beginning a life committed to your spouse, somewhat separate from that of your family of origin. Now, never mind the fact that the culture at the time didn't quite allow that in the way that we do that today. The fact of the matter is there has to be some sense of commitment to the marital relationship and some kind of creation of autonomy from the family of origin. Well, Bachner finds that in the early years of marriage, this can become a kind of challenge. That is to say, you have to make the spouse the primary life partner. Or to put it differently, the role of the spouse increases while the role of the family of origin decreases. Now, the same can be said for the role of the friends of each spouse. But the fact of the matter is, this has to be negotiated. It has to be adjusted to. You have to find a pattern of what that looks like. So, for example, one more narrow area of the research is about the idea of advice giving. If you are having commitment challenges in the early year of a marriage, it's probably because one or both spouses continues to turn for the family of origin or to friends or for someone outside the marriage for advice about what's going on inside the marriage, or even about advice regarding the life of the husband and the wife. So, for example, if a spouse continues to turn to his or her parents for advice about whether to lease a car or buy a car, or advice about whether to take a job or not take a job, if the person or family outside the marriage becomes the one to whom the spouse is turning, well, that suggests a lack of commitment to making this marital relationship separate from the family of origin or separate from the friends. I have a friend of mine that got married at a relatively young age, while they were still in college, in fact. And because he was playing football on the college football team, he continually wanted to hang out with the guys and wanted to go out with them to parties after the games were over. Now, he didn't always take his wife, and he didn't always take his wife with him when the guys went out for something to eat after practice. In fact, he carved out quite a separate life for himself during football season from that of his spouse. Well, that's a really good example of someone who has a kind of commitment challenge to make the marital relationship a truly separate kind of relationship from those friendships that this particular person has. And so Bachner says that that kind of a dynamic creates possible communicative challenges. Bachner also talks about power as it relates to the early years of a marriage. And so in Bachner's research, what this means is that the husband and the wife have to figure out who will have power, in what realms of the marriage. How will that power be discussed? How will it be expressed? Is it accepted? Is it rejected? And so earlier in this session, or in this course, we talked a little bit about power as a lens through which to see marital communication. Well, power becomes really important in the early years of a marriage because that is the time period during which you're establishing the parameters of power. Who has it and how it's expressed and all of that kind of a thing. And so Bachner says that for this reason, there's a particular challenge for couples to figure that one out. And then finally, Bachner talks about closeness. And he talks about the idea that spouses have to fall into a pattern of closeness and that they have to balance that dialectic of integration versus separation, the dialectic of autonomy versus connection. And so all of these things are percolating in the early part of a marriage, and they all have communicative dimensions. Now, one thing that also comes very clear in the research is this. What happens in the marriage more often influences the communication in these early years of a marriage. Or to put it differently, the events of a marriage influence the communication in the early years of a marriage. But in the later years of a marriage, it's the communication that has greater influence than the events. So, for example, in the early years of a marriage, the first time, let's say, that a husband comes home from work late without having told the wife that he would be late, that is an event. And so when that happens, that event is more likely to have an influence on the communication in the marriage. Meaning, in this case, the wife is likely to be frustrated with the husband not talking with her and letting her know that he was going to be late, and so they have an argument about that. So that event, that what happened in the marriage, is influencing the communication. Now, later on in the marriage, say 10 or 15 years into the marriage, the communication in the marriage, whether the husband is self-disclosing or not, whether the wife feels as if communication has resulted in closeness or not, those communicative things are going to influence what happens in the marriage, meaning going to influence the way husbands and wives interact with each other. And so this is an important distinction to make because if you're aware of that distinction, you'll have a particular eye in the early years of marriage on how you respond to the events that occur in the marriage. And so how the wife responds to the husband being late without calling, or how the husband responds to the wife's criticism of him not calling, becomes particularly important. Not that it's unimportant later on in the marriage, just that it's especially important in the early years of marriage. And by the way, speaking of the early years of marriage, most research finds that a surprisingly large number of patterns of communication are fairly well cemented by the end of the second year of marriage. Or to put it differently, by the end of the second year of marriage, most couples have fallen into the kinds of patterns of communication that are likely to stick for many years to come. And so you might recall earlier we said that oftentimes there's what's called a window pattern, where a certain window of time opens up for communication to change or to not change. Well, that's exactly what's happening. When you get married, a window opens up for communication patterns to be established. And so by the end of the second year, that window is closed. Now, obviously, that's not true for every couple, and obviously it's not true in every communicative aspect of a marriage. But it's true often enough, and it's true with enough dynamics in a marriage that it's something that you need very much to be aware of. In these early years, by the end of the second year, there tends to be a rather increasing amount of conflict. Not that it's conflict-ridden, just that compared to the first 4 or 5 months, by the end of the second year, you begin to see more conflict. And that is natural, I suppose, because you're integrating more of your lives together as a married couple, and you're going through the challenges that Bachner's research identified that we discussed just 10 minutes ago. The research also finds that spouses will fall into clearly identified conflict styles. They tend to fall into clearly identified triggers of conflict. They tend to kind of have their own idiosyncrasies exposed, which oftentimes creates a kind of conflict. If the husband leaves the seat to the toilet up all the time, becomes a point of conflict. If the wife leaves her clothes on the floor all the time, becomes a point of conflict. And so husbands and wives fall into these patterns by the second year or so. It's also true that in the research, we find that most of the conflicts that occur are because of unmet and unarticulated expectations. Now that's true throughout the entire course of the marriage, but it's particularly true in the early years of a marriage, when you're encountering your spouse's expectations for the first time, and in particular, when you're encountering those expectations about topics you could not have imagined before the two of you actually got married. Finally, in the early years of a marriage, spouses will develop kind of family personality. That's a type of amalgamation or combination of the husband and the wife's individual personalities. And that forms a kind of backdrop for the communication. So for example, if the husband naturally likes to tease people and he teases his wife and the wife responds defensively back to that, then the two of them fall into this pattern of teasing and defensive response. And the husband may in fact invoke what we call the just kidding defense in one of my other classes. So let's say a husband teases his wife about her hair, and she responds with a defensive kind of a comment. And he responds with, whoa, 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 hey, lighten up, I was just kidding. Well, a husband and wife might fall into this pattern of communication, and so they develop a kind of personality for the two of them. It's the, in a sense, bickering, but not really bickering personality. Teasing, defensive remark, I was just kidding. And so there comes to be this kind of personality for the two of them that's not global in the sense that psychologists talk about personality, but it becomes a pattern of communication that makes the two of them as a couple unique perhaps from other kinds of patterns. And teasing is just one of the ways that works. There are other kinds of patterns where that also works. So for example, compliments, or for example, deception. By the end of the second year of marriage, people have fallen into patterns where they either accept or don't allow for deception in the marriage, or where compliments are either given or not given. And so by the end of the second year, a lot of things are set in place. Now, how long do the early years of marriage last? Well, we don't know. But let's talk about a different section of marital life, which is also quite common. Let's say that a husband and wife have children, and let's say that these kids are young. Let's talk about what happens to husbands and wives in their communication during the time when the kids are young. Well, one of the things we have to say is that children tend to be born into one of a handful of kinds of environments. Some kids are born into an environment where there is space for them, meaning the husband and the wife have such a relationship that when the child is born, they welcome that child. That child is folded into the normal interactions of the husband and wife. There aren't these kinds of barriers to the child fitting the overall lifestyle of the parent. Now contrast that with another kind of an environment. Some kids are born into an environment where there is no space for them. Maybe, for example, the husband is in a kind of a spot where he doesn't really quite have the time to be a father, and so a lot of the parenting falls on the shoulders of the mother. Well, this creates conflict. It creates tension between the husband and the wife, which will inevitably bleed over to the kids. And so as it bleeds over to the kids, it becomes a difficulty for both the child and the parents, and especially in the husband and wife relationship. And so because the child was born into an environment where there's no space, it creates all sorts of problems. And then a third possible environment is what we call a vacuum environment. It's where the child is filling a kind of vacuum. You might have heard, for example, of some people who believe that if they have problems in their marriage, if they just have kids, then that will solve all the problems. It will bring us closer together. It will give us a fresh start. Well, in that kind of a case, the birth of the child is trying to fill a vacuum. Or it might be that a wife feels lonely and not close to her husband, or neglected, or somehow not valued, and so she thinks that if she has a child, then that will bring her self-worth and give her purpose and meaning. And so the child at that point is trying to fill a vacuum. This also in the research tends to correlate with increased amounts of family conflict. And so as you might imagine, the latter two environments I just described are not good environments because they have communicative ramification. I mentioned earlier that you've heard it said that the roughest year of marriage is the first year of marriage. Well, statistically speaking, that's not true. Statistically speaking, the most difficult and challenging year of a marriage is the first year after the first child is born. And so it's true that overall marital satisfaction tends to drop to its lowest point during that first year after the birth of the first child. And one reason for that is because of the negative cycles of communication that often occur in that first year. Because of changes in bodies, because people are often tired, because there's an upheaval in family routine, because you have lots of other interested parties that are speaking into the parenting of the child and kind of how you transition from not being a parent to being a parent, all these kinds of things get meshed into the marriage. We oftentimes find it common for there to be greater levels of conflict, greater levels of tension, more miscommunications, and oftentimes just a kind of communicative climate that is not helpful to fostering marital closeness or marital satisfaction. And so the kinds of conflicts that occur tend to be more intense, they tend to be more frequent, and they tend more often to spiral out of control, where you start arguing about whose turn it is to change the child, and you end up arguing about the extent to which the wife is like her mother or the husband is like his rather detached father. And so it spirals more often here in this first year after the birth of the first child. And there are so many things going on with how people see themselves and see their bodies and see their roles as parents. People are adjusting to different roles in the family. And earlier in this course, we talked about roles as a lens through which to see family communication. There's just so much change that not only is it contributing to conflict, it's contributing to how we see ourselves. There are power differences. If a husband, for example, feels that he has less power now because the kids get first claim on his wife's time, then clearly there's going to be some possible communicative difficulties. And so what we find is that there are these swings in marital satisfaction where everything is good and then it's not good, and then it's better again and then it doesn't get good again. And this tends to be a recurring pattern throughout the young years when the kids are very, very young. This is especially true in the first 2 years of the birth of the first child, but as you might imagine, it's exacerbated if you happen to have twins or triplets, and it's exacerbated if you have a number of kids immediately after one another, such that there is only a year or so in between, let's say, the birth of 3 different kids. And so all of this creates a kind of background dynamic to where there is a challenge for husbands and wives to maintain marital satisfaction. Now, what can you do to ward off this litany of negative effects I've just talked about? Well, one of the things we find is that the closer husbands and wives were prior to the birth of that first child, and the more excited they are about being parents, the more likely it is that they're going to weather these storms and maintain a relatively high level of marital satisfaction. What we find is that the changes in communication in situations like that are more often due to circumstances and the volatile nature of what's going on than the changes in the spouse. Or to put it differently, because you have this closeness and because you have this sense of excitement and shared commitment to being parents, you're better able to weather the ups and downs that come with being the parent of a small child. The problem, of course, is that all too often spouses think the problem is with their spouse rather than with the circumstances. And so it's important to be able to separate out what's circumstantial from what's not. So, for example, if a wife is exceptionally tired because she's nursing a new child and she's adjusting to the changes in her body, and the husband is getting used to not having as much sleep and sharing in the care for the child, and he's never done that before, and the two of them are on their own, the child is still very young, or the child is teething, or the child is going through the terrible twos, and it's very difficult for the husbands and wives to manage all that kind of a thing. It's important in that context, as they communicate with each other, to be able to separate what's circumstantial. My wife is just tired. What's circumstantial? My husband is just trying to get good at this father thing, but it doesn't come natural, from what is actually a change in the spouse. And the research suggests that just as sentiment override and cognitive editing allows us to focus on certain things and ignore other things, seeing circumstances as opposed to changes in spouse becomes important in marital satisfaction during these years. And so what we say is that in the early years of kids, marital satisfaction is most challenged, but it gets better. Let's talk about the next era, which would be when you're parents of young children. So let's just call them elementary-aged kids, okay? School-aged kids. And when we look at that research, we see some very clear things. Typically, marital satisfaction rises rather significantly during the time when the kids are in school. If it's highest in the first few years of marriage, it's probably second highest here in this particular stage. And that oftentimes has to do with the fact that parents have fallen into their groove. They've started to figure out the parenting thing. They've identified who has power and who doesn't, and how the roles are going to work, and what closeness is going to look like, and how to balance the many dialectics that we've talked about already in this particular class. Sadly, however, sometimes spouses will use kids as a way to ignore marital problems. That is to say, they get so wrapped up in parenting that oftentimes the health of their marriage will take a back seat, which is interesting because oftentimes what we find is that although marital satisfaction is high, oftentimes lurking beneath the water are these kinds of problems that aren't addressed, but instead are tamped down in the name of keeping the satisfaction high and in the name of focusing on the needs of the children. We also know, for example, that the identity of the family tends to peak at this time. So imagine a family going to Disney World. The kids are all in, fourth, fifth, third, second grade. It's all exciting. It's fresh. You don't have the challenges of kids driving and kids dating and kids doing social media to the extent they will in the teenage years. And so as a family, there tends to be a stronger sense of identity. And that's important because we find that typically speaking, when there's a strong sense of family identity, it's more likely for husbands and wives to experience positive marital satisfaction. And so what we find then is that for the most part, things kind of hum along. Now, we'll say more about parent and child communication later in a separate portion of this course. So I won't say anything more specifically about parents and kids in communication during the school years. Instead, we'll save that. Now, in a similar fashion, I'm not going to talk a great deal in this session about what happens when the kids become teenagers. Because again, there's an entire section of this course that talks about parents and kids in communication, and in that section of the course, we'll talk about parents and teenagers. But let me say a few things about that period of life here in this session. Well, one of the things we know is that marital satisfaction will probably drop to its lowest or second lowest point during this section of a marital life cycle. Or to put it differently, if the first year after the first year of a child's birth is the hardest on a marriage, the teenage years is at least as hard and sometimes harder, idiosyncratically, for some couples. Now, this is important because conflict tends to be a more common part of the relationship between parents and teenagers, and that conflict oftentimes tends to bleed over into the parents' relationships. That's because oftentimes the mere presence of conflict between parents and their teenage kids creates an atmosphere of tension into which the husband's and wives' relationship has to function. And so what we find is that oftentimes these conflicts occur sometimes over the smallest things that blow up into big conflicts. And so that creates a kind of climate where conflict is more part of it, which raises questions about whether or not there needed to be a conflict and whether your spouse handled that conflict well. And so it oftentimes becomes kind of a spillover effect where the conflict between parents and kids spills over into conflict between the husbands and the wives. And let me call time out for a second. In talking about the marital life cycle in this session, you've heard me on many occasions mention the word conflict. Now, we'll have a lot more to say about conflict in a family setting in a later session. But for now, I want to underline this idea. Conflict is hugely important in marital relationships. It's hugely important in marital satisfaction. It's hugely important in virtually every context of family interaction, whether it's parents and kids, siblings, husbands and wives. Conflict is in many ways the key to a satisfying and successful marriage, meaning whether there is conflict, what it's about, how it's handled, how intense it is, how you respond to it, what your style is, what you say in it, how you recover from it, all of that, this big ball of conflict-related stuff, is hugely important to marital success, marital health, and marital satisfaction. Well, when it comes to the life cycle, conflict gets plugged in because we've seen, for example, how conflict can be an important part of what goes on in the teenage years with this spillover effect that I talked about. And so I had to call time out simply to say that this is a reaffirmation of the importance of conflict and how husbands and wives handle that in their marital relationship. One of the things that often becomes important during the teenage years is this idea of alignment. Now, earlier in this course, we talked about alignment, this idea of coalitions or perceived closer connections among family members. It's very common in the teenage years for there to be alignment. So, for example, it might be that there's a perception that father yells at the kids more often than mom does. And so the kids feel aligned with mom because she seems to kind of get that their father yells at them too often, and that she seems to think that sometimes he yells unnecessarily. So there's alignment there that kind of freezes the father out. And in the teenage years, husbands and wives have to be very careful about how the alignment works, because that alignment is both common, but it also can be very threatening. Because the extent to which there's a strong alliance, in this case between the kids and mom, the father's frozen out, which tends to raise the possibility of a fractured or contentious relationship between mom and dad, husband and wife. Another common communicative thing that occurs in the teenage years is for one of the parents involved to be more of the reporter, meaning one of the two parents commonly just knows more about what's going on in their kids' lives, and so they report it back to the other spouse. So maybe, for example, because mom works long hours and dad takes the kids to school and picks the kids up and helps them with homework and has a chance to interact with them, he knows more about what's going on at school with the kids' friends, with the kids' progress in school, all that kind of a thing, than the mom does. And so when the husband and wife are talking, the husband reports, in a sense, to the wife about what's going on in the kids' lives. That's a very common thing that occurs during the teenage years. And while you might think that more often wives play that role than husbands, you'd be right. Even in the 21st century, with the expansion of women in the workforce, with kind of the changing roles of parents, the research suggests that wives, mothers, still tend to play that role far more frequently than do their husbands. There's another idea that tends to animate this entire section of the marital life cycle, and that is this idea of parenting scripts. Parenting scripts is just this idea that parents have it in their head that their kids will grow up a certain way, that they'll do certain things. So one script, for example, might be that a parent expects his son to be a responsible kind of a kid, that works hard, that gets a job, that is not lazy, that does everything that's necessary to be a good, and proper worker. Well, the kid might not always do that. The kid might be a little more low energy. The son might be the kind of kid that is more interested in playing video games. And so the kid, in doing this, isn't quite following the parenting script. Now, parenting scripts are narrow versions of larger expectations. The script oftentimes comes to specific behaviors in specific situations. So, for example, the father might think that part of being a responsible son is not having to ask, hey, what can I do to help out? Instead, you just look around and see that the grass needs to be cut. So you cut the grass. Or the trash needs to be taken out. So you take the trash out. And so the idea is that the parent has this script, this set of specific behaviors that the parent assumes will happen because, after all, I've raised the child this way, and I'm a good parent, and if I'm a good parent, the child will do that. Now, never mind the fact that that completely assumes a lack of individuality on the part of the child. Never mind that oftentimes these parenting scripts are highly unrealistic, and in some cases outdated. The fact of the matter is, most parents have these scripts, and they become very, very evident in the teenage years. Kids prior to that are just simply too young. And so what we find is that in the teenage years, there tends to be, you guessed it, conflict when teenagers don't follow the script. But at the same time, there tends to be this conflict or tension between husbands and wives about whether the husband's script is valid or not, whether the husband ought to abandon the script or not. And so these parenting scripts, I think, become very, very important because a lot of the conflict that occurs in the teenage years gets back to that notion of a parenting script. By the way, at this point in the session, I think you might be asking yourself, so what parenting scripts did my parents have for me? If you can answer that question, I think you'll shed a lot of light about how your parents parented you. Well, finally, let's wrap up by talking about some of the research on how parents interact with and how their marital satisfaction is affected by the communication with emerging adult and adult children. So emerging adults is a phrase that is typically used by sociologists to refer to what's going on after kids leave the home. So consider it between the 18th and 30th birthday. So kind of the 20s, the late teen years. Think of kids that have left the house and started to make their way in life, whether they've gone off to college or joined the military or simply moved out and gotten a job. They might be married, they might not be married, but the fact of the matter is the nest is empty. Well, how does that influence marital communication? Well, surprisingly, a large proportion of husbands and wives experience diminished marital communication quality after the kids have left the house. And principally, this is because the husband and wife are both understanding a change in role. So parents, for example, well, these are mothers, for example, had a very clearly defined role, very active role typically in parenting the kid. Well, when their child goes off to college, that active parenting role changes. Frankly, it diminishes. And so that role diminishment sometimes can create some problems in the wife's mind about how it is she can be a parent to an emerging adult, because she's not sure how to do that. The things she used to be able to do to parent her teenage child who is still at home, she can't do anymore. So that calls into question her worth and her value as a parent, which can cause problems between she and her husband, because her husband isn't experiencing this and doesn't see things through the same kind of lens. And so that creates a possible friction point between the wife and the husband. That's just one example of the way that all this might shake out. One of the things that we also see is that husbands and wives have different views about exclusion and inclusion. So, for example, some parents very much want to be included in the lives of their emerging adult children. You might have understood this if your parents were continually peppering you with text messages and questions about how it's going at college, and are you dating anybody, and have you thought about your major yet, and what do you want to do as a job when you grow up? Have you found a part-time job yet? See, parents want to be included in lives. Well, the research finds that husbands and wives often have very different views about inclusion and exclusion. Typically, wives have a greater view toward inclusion. That is to say, they want to be more included in the lives of their emerging adult and their adult children. Husbands, on the other hand, tend to be happier with greater levels of exclusion. They're happier, in a sense, allowing the child to live his or her own life with relatively minimal intrusion. So because of that, that creates some challenges for the marital satisfaction of the husband and wife. Husband thinks the wife might be trying too hard and needs to back off. The wife thinks that the husband doesn't care as much and needs to be more invested or to care a little bit more. We also understand that the adult children, from their perspective, underestimate the importance of life inclusion. That is to say, the kids underestimate the importance that typically mom feels in being included in their lives. And so these kids tend not to communicate as much with the mom as the mom would like. But the kid doesn't realize how important it is to the mother to partake in that kind of communication. And so for spouses that are empty nesters, they face particular tasks which they have to manage if they want to have high marital satisfaction, one of which is changing the conception of the interactions with their kids. I said a minute ago that we have to balance this exclusion and inclusion kind of a thing. One of the things that often happens is that the hierarchy between parent and child becomes flatter, becomes diminished as children become adults. So imagine a 26-year-old child who has gone to college and graduated and gotten a job. That child is likely to interact with his parents more on an even level, more as friends, so to speak, than as parents and children. By the way, that's particularly true of mothers and daughters. That dyad, that combination, is more likely to make this transition from parent to child to parent to friend more quickly than our husbands and daughters, or husbands and sons, for example. Nonetheless, this dynamic is something that does contribute to marital communication and marital satisfaction, because the extent to which the husband and wife are on the same page, so to speak, of this unfolding, the more likely it is to go well between the two of them. It's also quite common that after the nest is emptied, the patterns of communication between the entire family have been changed. When the last child leaves the nest and the husband and wife are together, there's this period of reacquaintance that has to happen. They have to kind of get to know each other again. They establish new routines. They tend to have more time on their hands. They have, if not fewer worries, a different set of worries that have to be navigated. And so one researcher calls it reacquainting yourself with your spouse. And while this can lead to increases in marital satisfaction, there's usually a period of adjustment to all of that. By the way, that's not at all that different than the research that finds there's a period of adjustment when one spouse retires or when both spouses retire after having worked in the work world. There's also, at that point in the life cycle, a similar kind of reorientation to what interactions are going to be between husbands and wives. And so these are the kinds of challenges that in the research become part of what happens after the kids have left the nest, and they have their own set of dynamics, which in turn have communicative implications. And so, because marriage is supposed to be until death do us part, there will be the inevitable trudging through the life cycle, oftentimes featuring kids, oftentimes featuring kids that leave the nest, and so all of those things do have an impact on marital satisfaction and marital success. And so thus far in the course, we've been able to talk positively about what contributes to marital satisfaction and marital success. We've looked at lenses through which to see family communication. We do, however, now have to spend a little bit of time talking about the dark side of family communication. We need to talk a little bit about communication in distressed marriages, and talk about communication when families are stressed, and talk about communication as it relates to conflict that occurs in a marital setting. And so, in future sessions, we'll talk about that so-called dark side of marital communication, and I think you'll see that we know a fair bit about that. And once you know that research, I think you'll be in a better position to successfully navigate and maintain happy, satisfying marriages. So we'll press on with that research in subsequent sessions.